Hey all, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be building a simple Markdown blog with F# and Falco. So I've run my Markdown blog with F# and Giraffe for the past few years, and I've been very happy with it. But I've recently started building my web apps with Falco instead, and thought it would be nice to migrate my blog to Falco as well. Both is a bit of an experiment, and I do think it's a little bit easier if all of your apps are running kind of the same technology, so when you need to go do maintenance on them, there's a little bit less context switching. And so in this post, we'll dive into building a Markdown blog with F# and Falco. Now, in this post, we're going to go into a lot of code. I'm going to show you my example project and stuff, but we can't go through all the code because that's thousands of lines. And so Haminions members do get access to the full source code on GitHub, along with dozens of other example projects if you want to just, git clone it and run it yourself. All right, so let's start off with an overview of the blog. So basically it has a few routes. It's got just an index route. It's got says blog, which lists all posts. It's got /blog/slug, which actually allows you to access the blog post, with the slug being its file name. And that's kind of how we're giving it a unique identifier that's easy to remember and find. And then /tags and tag, which lists posts with the associated tag. And so let me show you what this looks like. So here in my example repo, I am going to shut down my container and run my container. I like to run things in Docker containers because it's just easier for me to basically define all the dependencies of my project with the project in code. So I ran my one command. It's going to be running for a while because I guess I cleared the cache or something. Cool, and now it's running. All right, and this is what it looks like. This should look very similar to my own blog because this really is kind of a pull of the core infrastructure from my blog. And so it's using Tailwind for styles, and I'm just using the same styles that I used on mine. I've torn out these pages. I just wanted to show kind of how they could be added, but they aren't really in there. But the cool part is in the actual blog here. So I have three just simple posts to use as an example, and they are sorted in descending order, so the newest item comes first. And if we were to click into one of these, we can see that we get actually post 2, that there's really nothing in here. And then we see this tags list here, and if we go to the tags list, it will also show everything with the tags. And so that's kind of the core functionality that we'll be building in this video today. Okay, so here's kind of what the flow is going to look like. A request is going to come in. Falco is going to handle that. It's going to map it to the actual functionality we want, like are you looking for a specific blog post or a blog post list or a tags list. Then it's going to hit our data repo, which is filled with basically metadata of Markdown files. Then we're going to convert that into HTML, return it to Falco, and then we're going to turn this into a full HTML page and return that. So that's the basic idea. And so, a bit more information about this. Basically, all my blog posts are stored as Markdown files. And I can prove this to you here. Basically, I have a static folder here, and then I have a post template, which looks like this. And then one of these example posts is going to look like this. And so basically, front matter is like metadata, and this is YAML here. And so it's got a title, it's got a date, and it's got tags. And then the actual blog post comes down here, and you can put whatever markdown you want in here. So this is kind of how the file itself is set up. And then one last thing to call out while we're here is that the file name itself is the slug. So this is the unique post ID, which just keeps things nice and streamlined because you don't have to remember another unique identifier anywhere. Okay, and I like Markdown because it is a well-supported format that is easy to write. I honestly write basically all my online documents in Markdown. My READMEs are in Markdown. You can do Markdown with Confluence. You can do Markdown with Google Docs. It's very well supported, very easy to read. I think it's a great writing format. It also allows me to write, store, and deploy my posts alongside my code base, which I find efficient. So basically, if my blog runs, all my posts are already there. For a huge site like a CNN or a Forbes or something, this probably wouldn't make sense because the files would be too large to deploy with it. But for a small site like this, it's totally fine. And then I'm using YAML front matter for metadata because it's just pretty standardized, and it's what my blog posts are in. For Markdown to HTML, I basically pre-process my blog post metadata for fast lookups. And then I do the Markdown post to HTML conversion on hit using markdig to Markdown, or for Markdown to HTML. And this is something, I don't know if this is necessarily the best decision, but I did this because I didn't want to have too much memory pressure of just holding the full HTML in memory. This is probably fine because I don't have that many blog posts, but this is just something that worried me. And so I was just whatever, we'll try it on hit, and it's very fast, so it doesn't really matter. But something to consider if you're trying to use this in production. And then finally, I'm using YAML.net for front matter parsing. These are two things that I really just don't want to build myself. And, the power of running F# on .NET is that we get full access to all of the great .NET libraries out there. And Markdig and YAML.net have been well supported over the years, are very popular, have lots of docs. So I think this works out pretty well. And then finally, we need to serve this with Falco. Falco is the web app. And so we're basically just using that to map our endpoints to the functionality we need. And then I'm also using Falco.markup as an HTML DSL for building the surrounding site, just because I find it easier to work with F# and it's very performant. So why not? All right, so that's how the blog works. Now let's start stepping through these sections. First, we'll talk about Markdown to HTML. And so the core of the blog is really converting Markdown files to something we can use. And here an internal representation that can be turned into HTML. And so the metadata itself are title, date, and tags like I showed you. And we store these because we basically need it for list and sort operations. And then we store this info on the actual Markdown post in the YAML front matter. The blog post itself is just, whatever the rest of the post is, which is written in Markdown. And to parse these, I'm using two libraries linked here, Markdig for Markdown, YAML.net for YAML front matter. And so basically on app startup, what I'm doing is I'm creating a post service which preprocesses all of the posts in my file system into couple lookup tables that make it available via a few repo functions. And so really the important ones here are get post, given a post ID, which will return the post if it exists, otherwise none. Get ordered posts, which takes in pagination params so that we get the ordered posts back. And then get post for tag, which takes in the tag and then also does pagination on it. So I really only have two types. We've got a post and we've got a post list. The post, again, it's really just pulling out the front matter and the tags. And then it just has the body as a raw text string. This is, I believe, raw HTML. And then we have the post list itself. So we've got our posts and then our just pagination params. So what is the total count in this query? What is the page number? What is the page size? And now there's quite a bit of steps in this. So we're going to try to walk through this quickly, and then I'll show you in code for things that I think might need some more explanation. But this is basically how we go from file to front matter in Markdown and then convert that into HTML. And so the first thing we need to do is create a Markdig Markdown pipeline, which tells it how to parse this incoming file. And basically we just use the standard pipeline, but we do tell it that hey, we're gonna have YAML front matter so that it knows to pull that out and not treat it I don't know what it is in Markdown, a divider or something. But this is how we tell it. It's not that, this is actually YAML front matter, and we want you to separate that out. We're then going to create a YAML front matter parsing pipeline using YAML.net. And then, here's the pipeline for that. We tell it that we're using lowercase and that we want to ignore unmatched properties, because I think I have a few old posts that have random fields in it that I don't use anymore. And then we create a function separating out the front matter from the rest of the Markdown post. This was really confusing to me, but basically this pipeline seems to pull out the YAML front matter, but it does not separate them. And so if you render it, you'll actually render the front matter with the post, which is not what I want from my blog. And so what this does basically is it takes in the Markdown document, which is coming from our Markdown. Actually, I'll show you this in the actual code base. Okay, we're back in the repo. And basically we get the Markdown document, which is returned via our Markdown pipeline. And what we're going to return is the front matter itself, which is just our metadata of date, tags, and title. And then the remaining Markdown without the front matter, so that we're not, rendering this thing twice, because really I just want it for metadata. I don't actually want to render it into HTML. And so basically what I do is I try to find the front matter block here. I then turn this into a string, and then I deserialize this into the actual front matter object that I have using YAML.net. And then I remove the YAML block from the Markdown document so it's not there anymore. And now we have a separated version. We have the front matter here, and then we have everything else here. There's probably a smarter way to do this, but this is the best way I could come up with. Okay, once we've done that, we then create a method to make it easy to do the post parsing based on the post ID. This is basically the core abstraction, if you will, that given a post ID will turn this into something you can actually use. And so we basically use this to get the raw post string. This is just getting the file and turning it into a string. If we don't have it, then we just return none because we couldn't find that thing. Then we can see that we turn it into the actual Markdown document. We then get the parse document, which is the separated front matter with the remaining Markdown. Then we take out the metadata that we have here, and then we return our actual post internal state here. And then we just wrap it in a try catch because, is possibility that we can't access the operating system or the files or whatever. Lots of potential for errors with I/O here, so we just print those out and return nothing. And then finally, we put all these together to cache the common post lookup patterns and make it available to callers. And so basically, you create this thing, then we're going to get all the post paths. So basically finding, where in our server or computer these files actually live. And then we find all post paths by enumerating all the files that we actually have in that path. Then what we're going to do is we're going to make a nice lookup here, which is all post IDs to path lookup, just to make it really easy to say, like, once you have an ID, how do you actually find that thing? Get post drawstring, like I said, it gets the post path, and then it's just literally reading all text. We've already been over all of the pipeline stuff, how to get our post. And then this is kind of where we're turning all this into like something cacheable and usable. So we make this little function, get all posts, which basically enumerates over all post IDs to path lookups, but it's also going to make this into something usable. It's turning the raw strings into the actual post object that we have. Then it's just going to take its ID, then we're only choosing the ones that like actually exist. Like if we weren't able to actually produce this, then it'll return none. So we only take the ones that actually worked, and then we turn this into an actual list. And then we cache these basically here. So we have date ordered post IDs, and this is useful because I order all of my posts in descending order. So we just sort by descending, we map it to ID, and then we just have the list of that. So this is just the IDs, and we know how to get the markdown from there. Then we do the same thing for tag posts to IDs lookup. This is a little bit more involved, and so you can go through it by yourself, but basically we're just mapping all this stuff to all of their tags, grouping by the tags, mapping them so that we get, tuples of tag to ID list, and then we're creating a dict of that. And then we just have some helpers here for, given post IDs, let's paginate these. And we use that to help us with our ordered posts across all posts and for our tag posts across just posts in the tag. And then here are like our repo functions. That really is just making all of these functions that we went over public so that people can actually call them. So I know that's a lot of code. All of it's here if you want to go through at your own pace and reference it. And again, if you want like the full source code, so you can just pull it down and run it and look through it, you can go get that at the example repo. Okay, so now serving with Falco. So now we have a way to pre-process all of the Markdown files into something easy to access. Now we need to connect our endpoints to produce HTML from them. Now, as a reminder, the blog has a few primary routes. So we've got the index route, /blog to list all posts, /blog/slug to actually look at a post, and then /tag/tag to go through a list of all posts in that tag. And, this example project also has an about page to be more like real, more similar to like my blog itself. But we're not going to really touch on that because it's just not the main thing. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is our actual endpoints. And basically, here's how I'm doing the index endpoint. I have almost always like a render function that will actually render the HTML. I'll usually wrap these in an HTTP context helper function or HTTP handler if there's any kind of more like business logic or mapping. But if it's just simple like this, I'll just inline it. And then I have a helper for render view, which is going to basically turn the returned XML node into HTML. So here's our index page. It says go render the index page. Here's our about page. It says go render the about page. And then we get to /blog here where we have an HTTP handler. We're basically saying, hey, go get the page number from the HTTP context. And then we're going to tell it to, render the returned XML nodes, return from post list page handler. We give it our service tree, which just really is our context, and it has our post service in it. And then we pass down its props, which is just the title of the page number, and the page size. For /blog, we do something similar, but here we're just fetching the actual slug string from it. And you can see the URL pattern here. And then we put this in the post page handler, again, passing in the context, and then its props. And for tags, we basically do the exact same thing, except now we're getting the tag string, and then we're passing it to the tag list page handler. So that's basically how we are routing endpoints with Falco. And I do have these two helper functions that you see a lot in these helpers. The first is just the render view, which is how we're converting these XML node HTTP handlers to HTML. An XML node is just the building block of Falco.markup, which is how I'm actually rendering my HTML or building it in my code. And you can see it's like very simple here. Just takes in our handler, returns HTTP handler. It itself is HTTP handler. Then it basically gets the result of the inner handler, and then returns response.of.html, passing the result, which is an XML node, and then giving the context so you continue the chain. Get page number from context does what it says. We get the query, we try to get the page. If it's not there, we just default to 0, so that we always have like a deterministic pagination operation here. Another thing to call out is like, so I'm rendering everything with, markup, but I find that there are some patterns with this that make sense to pull from kind of other frameworks and paradigms of doing this. And one of those is to render the base layout of my site in a core function, just so that we can kind of have uniform, whether it's layouts or metadata or, styles or libraries that we have on the page. I find that this just makes it much easier to have that kind of base layout. And then that means that each page can just focus on like what's actually in the page and then just rely on the base layout to actually get everything, put together and working. And so this should look familiar if you've used kind of any like templating engines or anything. And so basically you say render post layout and then you give it a head, body, and footer. And what it's going to do is it's going to have some stuff pre-set up. So here's, the HTML element. We have our head where we are setting some metadata. We have our style sheets. We have our script here. This time I'm doing anchor tags. But then we yield whatever you put in there so that you have some customization at the page level. We do the same thing with the body. Here we're rendering navigation on every page, so we don't need, every page to have to remember to do this. And then we just have in our main element here whatever you passed in the body. And then for the footer, there's just like no uniform stuff we have in there, so if you want to put something in there, you can. All right, now on to listing posts. So basically, the handler just calls the renderer, then the renderer gets the ordered post from the data repo and creates the HTML, the DSL. So here's the handler. It's really not doing much. All it's doing is really calling the renderer here, passing through the service tree or context and props. And here we're actually doing something in the renderer. So we're looking at our context, we're getting out our data repo, and then we're saying get ordered posts and passing in the props that we have. And then we call render post layout here. But most of the rendering itself is doing it in render post list component. In general, I do like to separate my actual renderers from any kind of data fetches we do or anything like that. I think this is how you can basically build composable HTML components, if you will, even if you're not using like a React or like web components or something. Like all components are things that you can compose together. And so by separating out these use cases of the data fetch and the actual turn this into the UI element, I think makes this stuff a lot more composable. And so here we have like a section, we have our H1 for our title, then we create an unordered list, and then we just iterate over all the posts we were given, and each one is just a list item. We have our links here, paragraphs here containing the date, and then this little separator guy and all the tags with their links. And then I build my previous and next buttons down here, depending on, if we actually have more elements or not. Now for rendering a single page, we do something similar. Handler calls render post page. Render post page is getting the data from the repo, and then we're actually building the UI with this render post typography component. And this is going to actually create the typography there. Render tag links takes an URL prefix and a post. It's going to iterate over the tags and collect all of these into a list. Render post typography is basically, where most of this stuff's happening. If you're given a post where we don't actually have it, we're just going to give you a generic like 404 no post found. But then if we do have something, that's when we're going to actually create, the title. We're going to create a paragraph section with the date and all the tags. We're going to create a divider, and then we're actually going to do the post area. And this is where we're using text.raw on the post.body because we already have our markdown body as just raw HTML. And so we don't need to back that into Falco.markup because it's already in HTML. So we just use text.raw to be like, trust this, it's HTML, render it as HTML. We can trust this because it's coming from my system, but don't do this if this is HTML coming from someone else. And then this is how I'm actually adding anchors to all of my header links here. Yeah, and that's the general gist. I have another section on tag lists, but it's basically the same as the blog list, except we're doing post by tags. I'm using that other helper from our data repo, so I'm not going to dive into it much here. Next. Yeah, so that's how I run my blog with Markdown posts served with F# and Falco. Now, it's definitely not the most scalable or robust method. I'm sure there are much better ways to do this, but it served me well so far. I'm currently serving about 900 posts to around 300 visitors a day, with request latencies in around 10 milliseconds, CPU of around 1%, and memory usage around 30%. On Google Cloud runs smallest box. This is basically a 1 vCPU, 512 megabyte RAM box, and so this can scale to quite a lot more users and posts, and I'm really not worried about that at all. Now, I know we went through a lot of code very fast here, so as a reminder, if you want to get the full source code, it's available here in my example repo for and minions members, and all the code I went through today is literally in this, along with dozens of other F# example projects if you're trying to see what some real projects look like. Now, if you like this post, you might also build a simple Markdown blog with F# and Giraffe. This is how I built and ran my blog for the past few years before migrating here to Falco. You might also be interested in spin up a full stack F# web app in 10 minutes with the Cloud Seed project template. This is basically how I start most of my projects these days. And finally, what we learned running F# in production for 5 years, kind of an analysis of experiences people have had trying to run their apps with F#, especially with the downside of it being a pretty small language. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.